wir sprechen heute mit Louise und Esteban von Debt for Climate. Esteban spricht kein Deutsch, sondern Englisch. Unter anderem Englisch natürlich. Das heißt, ich wollte euch gerne fragen, ob es Menschen gibt, die Englisch nicht so gut verstehen. Wenn ja, dann kommen wir mit einem Sprachmix zurecht und organisieren uns. Dann dürft ihr das sehr gerne ohne Bedenken sagen. Sowohl gilt das für den Stream, ich glaube, da gibt es bestimmt eine Kommentarfunktion, als auch für Menschen hier im Raum. Sollen wir uns so organisieren, dass wir hauptsächlich auf Deutsch sprechen und übersetzen? Oder ist es fein, wenn wir auf Englisch wechseln? Alle happy? Okay, gut. Und du würdest mir sagen, Alex, wenn es Kommentare im Chat gäbe?
Da wünscht sich keiner.
Sehr gut. Then this means we can switch to English. I think that's a good, that's good news because then it's easier to organize, of course. And if anyone has a question, then just raise your hands and ask. And with this, I think I come to Esteban and Louise, to you. Before I introduce you, or you introduce yourself, I think we have a short video about introducing Debt for Climate, and I guess we just start with that one.
Do you want to say something about it?
No, that's cool. We can explain.
There are also subtitles to the video. There are going to be, I think, French and Spanish parts, so if you can't see them there, you are allowed to stand up. Geht es lauter? Hier drauf?
War ja klar, dass wir irgendwas vergessen. Warte.
Vielleicht einfach das technische Saalmikrofon. Das geht nicht besser.
Das hier? Ich auch nicht, ehrlich gesagt. Ich dachte, der kommt über den Beamer raus, oder? Ihr könnt es hören, oder?
Ja.
Aber für den Stream.
Leg das ruhig dahin.
Aber ich weiß nicht wo.
Der Laptop, ne?
No.
Is the microphone on?
Mhm.
lema, la deuda es con los pueblos y con la naturaleza. That's over that now.
La deuda es con el pueblo y la naturaleza. Turn debt into climate action. Turn debt into climate action. Climate justice now. Queremos justicia climática.
That is only the start of a campaign, multi-year campaign, to hold the Global Nord accountable for its climate obligations to the Global South.
I think I've seen this video for like 70 times and I still get goosebumps. It's like, oh, when did this?
Do you need the microphone?
You are
we
connected
have this.
here.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think we are good. You can hear us well? Yeah.
Okay.
Do we still need the beamer? Or can we turn it off?
I think you could turn it off.
Yes. Okay. All right. I just read my notes for a second. So, it's an honor and a real pleasure to have you here because I think we saw in the video already that Debt for Climate organizes like really impactful stuff, and we would love to learn more from you too about. Now I'm missing the English words, but we will manage probably about everything we do and the Forderungen.
Demands.
The demands, thank you, that you have. Before we start discussing all the content that we would love to discuss, a few words about the two of you. Esteban, I start with you. You are an scientist and activist from Argentina. I learned from you, Louise, Esteban was in the front lines when it comes to fracking, fighting fracking in Argentina. You co-founded the platform EcoLeaks and also the Grassrootsbewegung, grassroots movement, Debt for Climate. Thank you for coming. Louise, you are part of Debt for Climate too. You are a Umweltsoziologin.
Environmental sociologist.
Thank you very much. Since many years in international movements about climate justice and in national and global organizations active. So you're doing lots of stuff, but not only Debt for Climate. And I'd love to learn more about you. If you want to introduce yourself with a personal note, I'm super happy, and I would be, as an opener, super interested in why did you found Debt for Climate, or why is it close to your heart? Why do you think it is super important to be active?
You want to start? No, you start. Yeah?
No?
Okay. Well, no, the question is why founding Debt for Climate? I think that one goes to you.
Okay, yeah. So thank you, Anna. Thank you for inviting us. It's great to be here to talk about financial colonialism in the financial capital of Europe's most powerful country. And Malina was just telling us earlier that the Koala Collective is the only grassroots collective that is actually tackling finances in Germany, which is crazy to think. And you know how important this is and how it's being it's not being done at the level that we should be doing it nationally and internationally. So thank you for your work, and I think I speak for both of us. We're very excited to meet you because I think there's so much that we can do together. I come from the front lines of fighting against fracking in Argentina, in Vaca Muerta. We have the world's second largest shale gas basin, known as Vaca Muerta. It's the fourth largest shale oil basin. It's a huge carbon bomb for the planet. It's about the size of Belgium, and it alone will consume more than 10% of the global carbon budget. Now, this carbon bomb is one of hundreds of carbon bombs that are mostly in the global south that keep getting exploited, contrary to what the Paris Agreement says and all these other commitments that governments are signing on paper. The opposite is happening in reality. Fossil fuel companies and all this financial power is doing the exact opposite, and debt is playing a major role in all of this. So I don't want to go on forever in the introduction, but should I just explain how we started Debt for Climate? We've been fighting fracking in my case for several years, and the situation is only getting worse. Since I arrived in Germany, because I had to flee Argentina, we founded a platform called EcoLeaks, where we publish secret documents from the Argentinian government that were revealing contamination of the water tables by the first wells of fracking in my province, Mendoza. And this led to huge revolts of tens of thousands of people building a huge resistance movement, but also we got heavily persecuted, death threats, political operations, and so on. So 3 years ago I came to Germany and I started working with Ende Gelände, XR, Fridays, and any group that wanted to do something against gas and fracking. And with Ende Gelände, we moved from coal to gas. The last few actions have been really focusing on gas, which is the counterpart of, they destroy our homelands, European companies, Wintershall from Germany, and then they export the gas in the form of LNG to consume in Europe, right? So we found, especially after the war, things are only getting worse. And we are not going to win this if we are just going to block, the construction site for a weekend, like with Ende Gelände, or if we're going to do a performative action one time. We need to build more power. We need to think strategically, because this is a fight for survival. It's not a hobby. We have to be serious about this. And from trying to do just that, my country is in one of the biggest debt in the world right now. A few years ago, it got the biggest loan in the history of the IMF worldwide. IMF, the International Monetary Fund. 20 years ago, we were an example to the world when we kicked the IMF out of Argentina. It was 2001. I was a teenager and I was there on the streets when we ousted the government. The president had to flee on a helicopter. It was, a reaction from the people who were exhausted from austerity policies and from the IMF. And 20 years later, unfortunately, Argentina is back in the same situation or even worse, because we're even poorer than 20 years ago. Now we have more than 50% poverty. The situation is desperate. And how is Argentina paying for this? Extracting anything they can. Gold, silver, gas, oil, offshore drilling, mega mining, deforestation. Argentina is paying this debt by sacrificing its own population, the rural populations, to contamination, to this destroying the water sources. Most of this is desertic areas. And when you look at that, Argentina is not an exception. It's more like the rule for the Global South. The way that colonialism works today is, England, they don't invade you with armies like the British Empire 200 years ago or so. What they do nowadays is debt. They put you in debt so that you have to keep paying this huge interest. For Germany or for the US or England, it's really cheap to borrow money. 1%, something like that, 0% interest rates. But for the Global South, the interest rates are usury, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. So it's just impossible to pay. And the reality is most of these loans are illegal from the starting point. They're awarded to dictators. They are awarded unconstitutionally. In the case of the IMF with Argentina, they awarded this loan illegally to help right-wing President Macri, who was a friend of Trump, who was president of the US, and pushed for this loan to happen, to help him win the re-election. And they gave him $44 billion US. And even with that money, he lost the re-election. But the IMF, in doing so, violated its own statute to do that. And yet nobody questions that, and these loans get paid back many times over just in the interest. And I don't want to go on forever with this introduction, but we realize that we need to find common denominators to bring us together. That is not just the climate movements, but also social justice movements, labor unions, the working class. We are seeing a situation where the workers in Europe are getting antagonized from the climate activists with the cost of living crisis and everything that's happened, inflation. So they're going to blame the climate activists in the years to come after the financial crisis, which is coming very soon. We will be the scapegoats of politicians, especially populist right-wingers, who will say, because of them, you cannot feed your family, because these people are blocking a pipeline or a mine. We cannot allow that to happen. And we urgently need to build alternative narratives of international solidarity and also of solidarity between the working class and climate justice. So that's what Debt for Climate is for.
Getting applause for the introduction.
And I'm sure I can tell more later, but that's enough.
We will hear more, for
Yes,
sure.
that's enough. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this powerful entry statement. And Louise, to you.
Yeah, I think what really convinced me about Debt for Climate and what keeps me going in it is just that the connections that the movement is drawing, they are not artificial. They are not add-ons, but they are inherent in the demand, and not only in the demand, but in the form of organizing. You know, like a lot of movements in Germany, majoritively white movements, have been accused of being too white, of being too Eurocentric, and as a reaction to that, they added, like, oh yeah, but this somehow, I have a coupling in the microphone, yeah.
Maybe it's my microphone.
Maybe. I press it like this, it's okay. And they then just go on and they say, yeah, okay, so we somehow then not postpone, but like put it afterwards, search the connection afterwards to how our struggle is also related to struggles of the Global South, how it's also somehow anti-colonial. And from the left, the critique is coming like, oh, you're not anti-capitalist enough. Like, okay, so we're searching somehow how this demand or how our form of organizing is somehow still anti-capitalist. And you know, so you have this, or now the call to unite with labor movements. It's like, okay, somehow this is has also something to do with labor movements. And this is something that with Debt for Climate, it's not happening afterwards, after the critique is coming, but it's inherent in the demand. Like that cancellation, we will talk about it later on also, how it really connects inherently the struggle for environmental justice and social justice. We can talk about it later. It's a movement that was conceived and is being led by the Global South. It is anti-colonial by its demand, but also by its form of organizing. And even the anti-capitalist argument doesn't work with it, because you need to find these cracks in the system. Capitalism wouldn't work without these unpayable debts. You know, like that. You can see how the debt crisis really started coming with not started coming, but really took through the roof in the 1980s with neoliberalism coming. And the same with anti-colonialism, the whole, as Esteban was saying before already, colonialism, the continuation of the official colonial states is debt. So by abolishing debt and the debt system as it is right now, you have an anti-colonial movement. You have a movement that is connecting by its demand already to the labor unions, because in the Global South, it's directly connected to the struggles for better working conditions, because a lot of the, sometimes up to 50% or even more of the money of the people is spent on repaying back the debt that the sovereign debt that the governments have to pay. You know, so and when privatization is coming in because of austerity politics, the IMF is coming in and starting to privatize the whole economy, then the public sector is being cut. And who is most dependent on the public sectors? It's workers, it's women. Mostly you have to jump in also to compensate for the loss of a public sector. So it's not artificial, these connections. It's just really there. So that is something that has really convinced me and is keeping me convincing to just show these connections. It's bringing together so many different struggles that are connected in nature, but not in organizing and not in the demands. And Debt for Climate, with its demand and with its quite unique type of organizing, is bringing this together, not in an artificial way. And I think this is really why it's like a matter of heart to me to be part of it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Okay. Can you, in a nutshell, really simple, explain to us what your core key demand is?
Yes.
Debt cancellation for the Global South.
Debt cancellation for the Global South.
Or I mean,
I
think the German title actually of this event explains it quite well. It's like the Entschuldigung des Globalen Nordens is the Entschuldigung des Globalen Südens, right? So it has to do with the climate debt of the Global North, like how can we start to repay it? And the climate and the colonial debt of the Global North, and the first step to repay it is the cancellation of the debts of the Global South.
And if I may add, debt, unlike what they're saying on paper, like I said earlier, Paris Agreement and so on, is driving the expansion of the fossil fuel industry in reality. So if we can emancipate our countries of the Global South from this financial colonialism, not only will we have a chance to actually grow out of this form of slavery, but also to keep the fossil fuels in the ground. Cancel the debt, the financial debt, to enable a just transition for the Global South. You know, our countries are signing the Paris Agreement also, but how they will never be able to fulfill any of those goals. Nigeria's debt cost 2 or 3 months ago surpassed their national revenues. Okay, so what can Nigeria commit to in terms of a transition or reducing fossil fuel? The opposite is true.
Yeah.
So
Esteban, I think we need a few more examples of just for understanding what is the situation of debts for the Global South. A few more examples like this, because it sounds massive. It is probably massive. What you just said for the example of Nigeria. Can you give us a little more examples to understand really the size of the debts and the impact it has?
So when the IMF gave the loan to Argentina, this has been reported in the New York Times and other papers, that it was with the understanding that these loans would be paid back with Vaca Muerta, with the fracking of Vaca Muerta, with the deforestation, with the mega mining. So all around the Global South you can find these examples where in Ghana, in South Africa, in Sri Lanka, which is now nearing default, companies and the IMF and the World Bank are imposing all kinds of conditions for advancing of fossil fuel projects in order for these countries to pay back this debt. This is a commonplace situation, and we could send you articles much more. I want to make a disclaimer. I just came out of the hospital, had a spinal cord surgery. This is the first trip I make. This was 2 weeks ago only. I'm a little high on pain medication to be able to be here, but I really didn't want to miss coming here because it's really important, and I'm grateful to come. But just a disclaimer: if I say stupid shit or my memory doesn't work sometimes, I hope you can excuse me, and I'm sure Louise can correct me or compliment me.
I'll be tipping you on your knee when you start. But maybe I can do it.
Sure, yeah.
Actually, you gave the example of Sri Lanka. You have the more recent example of Pakistan, right? You have the flooding of a country that is drowning not only in floods and in water, but also in debt. And actually, there's especially also the private sector that is not allowing Pakistan to actually mitigate the consequences of these floodings, because they're like, no, you have to pay back the debt. You have to pay back the debt first, and then we help you get more money so you can adapt to the damages that have been caused. So it's this endless circles. You have Zambia as another example. I think their debt to GDP ratio is about like 160% or something like that. So the entire economy, the entire output of their economy is a lot less than what they are spending to pay back their debt. For Zambia, for example, it's the private sector, also the company BlackRock, that is a major bondholder of the sovereign debt of Zambia, and is refusing to cancel the debt and even relieving the debt. I think they're making 110% of profit of the Zambian sovereign debt that they are holding. So it's incredible what is happening there. The problem is with that. I wanted to. I noticed too late when I said like, oh no, we don't need to be here anymore. I had like a nice graphic.
We can put it on again.
No, too much time. You can Google it. It's on a website that is called Visual Capitalists. they have good resources to produce graphics about the capitalist state of the art. And there is one that shows these. That shows all the countries basically and how much they're indebted, or the GDP to debt ratio. The problem, why I'm saying this also, because a lot of them hopefully maybe some of you are going to Google this afterwards, and you will see the lists of these countries. And for example, Japan is rating really high. Spain is rating really high. The difference, and Canada also is rating really high. The problem is, and this is why I'm saying this, to be careful with these maps, because there's a huge difference between countries that are indebted in foreign currency and countries that are indebted in their local currency, because they can basically produce the money that they need to repay their own debt. And that's something that is not the case for example, in African countries that are indebted in dollars. So they have to actually import foreign currency, and they have to export stuff so that they can gain money to repay their debt in the foreign currency. So be careful a little bit with these when you Google like which countries are most indebted. And usually those graphics don't include these differences between being indebted in foreign countries, in foreign currencies, and your local currency, which is why it's not as bad if, for example, France is really indebted. Or it has different consequences as if, for example, Sri Lanka, Argentina, and so on are indebted. The consequences for the economy and also especially for the extractivist sector are very different. So, yeah.
Okay, and when we discuss this debt situation, and I hope this is not too technical for the audience, but I think important to understand, who are actually the players who are involved? Like, Is it governments? Is it private banks? Is it, we heard about the World Bank, like who holds the debts?
Should I start?
Yeah, well, it varies, obviously, depending on the country. China is really big in Africa, right? And it's growing. The past decade has been growing, the proportion of debt that China is holding on African and the Global South countries. The IMF and the World Bank are the biggest symbols of financial colonialism, right? They are the ones that no one can doubt that these people are behind modern day colonialism. China is relatively a new player into that game, but an important one. BlackRock, Vanguard, and other big private banks and institutions like those. We started by tackling IMF and World Bank for strategic reasons. We have to tackle China, we also tackle BlackRock, but the IMF and the World Bank are especially important because they are ruled by so-called democracies that claim to care about human rights and that claim to care the most about the climate. Germany, the G7 countries, the US and so on. So we think that they are the most vulnerable to democratic pressure. If we mobilize on the streets, if we build global pressure and power, we can actually have a chance to influence their decision making. For example, Germany holds the fourth largest voting power within the IMF. So if in Germany we could build power, especially here, like put pressure in Frankfurt and around Germany, so that Germany has to cancel or promote canceling the debt of the Global South to enable a just transition, is doable. I think China is less vulnerable to our pressure, but we must also tackle them. It's just that if we start with these two, we think that we can build enough consensus globally that canceling debt must be the no-brainer for climate action. It is the lowest hanging fruit according to what we think. So if we could get that to become a common sense worldwide, and the IMF and the World Bank leading the way, then China eventually will have to follow up with the rest of the world because we will create a global trend. And so will BlackRock and the others, who are also hard to tackle because they're not accountable to governments or to people who vote for them, but only to their stockholders. So it's just a matter of how and when, how can we start building power strategically to tackle the rest also strongly.
I think just a big problem with the whole global debt crisis and the issue is actually that there's a huge lack of transparency. So I think there's a study that shows that it's like 60% of global debt is quite unknown who actually holds it. Multilateral institutions like the IMF and the World Bank are one of the biggest powers in there. You have the private sector and also governments who hold who have a big role to play, basically. But I think the reason also why it's so important to shed light on the IMF and the World Bank is because we invite groups and people in their respective countries to do the research in what role their countries play in the global debt crisis. Because a lot of people are like, yeah, but what does Germany have to do with this? It's IMF, it's the US. And then if you or like, it's IMF is US imperialism, we can't do anything about it. Or we would have to go to Washington. But if you actually then look up like how the IMF is set up, you can see that the G7 actually are, I think, the largest voting powers in the IMF, with Germany being the fourth, which is why we took this action that you saw the video of when the G7 was held here in Germany, in Garmisch, to just put forward the knowledge about this also for groups that they can tackle the IMF, even here in Germany, to research a little bit about what the role of their country is, like who is sitting in the IMF, like what institutions are behind them, and what kind of actions can we take. So it's also like a really refreshing wind a little bit in the movement, and a politicizing attempt also to go deeper in the economic system that is behind the climate crisis, that is driving the climate crisis, and to really look like, okay, where do the power lay in our respective countries, and what are the levers basically that we can touch on so that we can build pressure in order to change this.
And then, I mean, you started to answer this already, but again, sitting in Germany, what is the German role? What can Germany do, and what obligations or responsibilities that Germany actually have, and what should we demand?
Well, I think, as Esteban was saying already, as being the fourth largest voting power in the IMF, it's already clear the US has a de facto veto power in the IMF. Because the IMF works...
Maybe first of all, what's the IMF?
International Monetary Fund, the Internationale Währungsfonds in German. Yeah, it was created. I think it was 1953, something in that area. No, it was earlier. After the Second World War, basically, to help restructure Europe. After the Second World War, Europe was destroyed. The economies of Europe were destroyed, and so the World Bank and the IMF were actually created to help reconstruct Europe and also Germany, and then. In a nutshell, basically, then the Marshall Plan was introduced in Europe and also in Germany, and it became less profitable for the IMF and the World Bank to invest in Europe because they had the Marshall Plan. They had money more or less for free, and this is when the IMF and the World Bank they started their sister institutions. So they started to migrate onto especially also the African continent because it was profitable, because there they could restart their profitable business to impose debts with the huge interest loans, while Europe had more or less the Marshall Plan. And this is, this is in a nutshell, because you asked, like, what is the IMF and the World Bank? And then the role of Germany, as you have, like, maybe some of you saw the actions that we took in Berlin, because Christian Lindner, he, for example, he is the deputy governor who sits in the IMF, and he's the actual governor of one of the four constitutive how do you say this? Like that make up those institutions, those committees basically that make up the IMF. One of them, he actually is the governor there, so he represents the German interests there, you know. So I think at least for the IMF and the World Bank, that is a very good lever to have.
And there's one more reason and one more really important target or potential in Germany is Germany's economic miracle after the war had a lot to do with the fact that they got their debt cancelled. Okay? Half of Germany's debt after the war, meaning the debt that was incurred by no other than the Nazi regime. The Nazi regime that caused the Holocaust and World War II got its debt cancelled to prevent Germany from falling into communism. So that gives us really powerful arguments when we say, if you were willing to cancel the debt of the Nazi regime who caused the Holocaust, you can definitely cancel the debt of the Global South to enable a just transition. It shows that it's possible, which they try to tell us it's not. It shows that it works, which they try to tell us it won't. So, and it shows the moral obligation. You know, Germany is with a huge climate debt as one of the biggest industrialized nations can and must lead the way. So there is a huge potential. And this London Accord, which is going to be 70 years next February 27 of this debt cancellation for Germany. So that's actually our next target globally. We'll put all the focus here on Germany. The next global action of Debt for Climate is February 27, so that we can cast the light on this double standard and show that it's possible. Mm-hmm. Yeah, next year. This is the 70th anniversary of the cancellation of Germany, of debt for Germany. Yeah.
23.
27. 27. Yeah?
27th of February 2023.
Okay.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Yes. No, yes.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so you're starting. No, but we should mobilize then.
Yes.
Or this is a mobilizing action.
Yes. But I think if I can complement to that as well, I think it also shows the colonialist setup in this, when they say no, it's not possible to do this for the Global South, because the so-called economic miracle, which is not a miracle, it's economic strategy and steps, right, that led to the economic development of Germany. It led to Germany being one of the most powerful economies in Europe, or maybe even in the world, you know? And so they know exactly what that cancellation, what an economic effect that cancellation has. And colonialism doesn't work in being beneficial for the colonies, as we know. So they know if they start to cancel the debt for countries of the Global South, they use political leverage. If you see it on the World Bank, Europe is like a tiny fart on the whole world map, and then you see the other huge continents that are full of resources. Europe doesn't have any of that, so it needs those other countries in order to be this imperial extractivist economy by externalizing the cost of the cost and internalizing the benefits of this. So as soon as you take away this political leverage in making possible the material and the financial flows from the Global South to the Global North, Germany and Europe loses its power, the economic and the political power. So this is exactly what they know that this is going to happen. And the argument of, this is going to cause Brettfahrer. So like if we start with one, all of them will follow. It's like, sorry guys, like you didn't start, but you had one of the massive, like the historical, massively important debt cancellations. So the argument from a German politician or German economist, like it won't work. So I think this is just something to really keep in mind too, that this is a political, strategic interest not to cancel the debt of the Global South, because Europe and the US are dependent on the political leverage that they have through the debt that the
so
other
do I
countries
get
owe.
it right that, like, when we compare the situation after World War II and why Germany's debts were half cancelled or to a major extent cancelled, and now the reason why they did this in the past was, in contrast to today, that today they need the countries of the Global South as to preserve the colonial structure, basically the post-colonial structure. And Germany in the after World War II times was not identified as a potential colonialist country in a way. So because I was wondering, so why is it? Why did they cancel the debts of Germany in the past, and why don't they do it right now? But there is a structural difference if you compare Germany and the countries of the Global South. Or is there another reason?
Well, Germany was a major global empire, and I'm not going to school you guys on your own geopolitics, but it was very clear at the time.
Sometimes it's good to do that.
Okay, but I'm also not a geopolitical expert, but it was a time of whoever could control Germany pretty much controlled most of the world, because it was the time of the Iron Curtain. You have the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc. So it was really important after the war that for the US-led West, that Germany would fall for that kind of ideology and not into the Soviet sphere of influence. The Berlin Wall was cutting through, so it was the place that was in dispute for the two worlds. And I think there's more than that, because it's not out of chance that Germany was at the center of two world wars. So Germany is central to the world of geopolitics, and whoever has control of the European mainland, it gives them the strategic advantage over everything else that they have control. So that's why the Soviets and the West were disputing Germany. So after the war, it makes sense, just like they did with Japan. The US turned Japan into a puppet state. Well, Germany today is an occupied country with 35,000 American soldiers and many military bases and nuclear weapons from the US. So it's an occupied country still. So that's because it's really important for the West. And it's become a real good ally of the West. So it worked for them. That's why I think they canceled the debt, and that's why the Marshall Plan, to really help Germany become an empire, but an empire that is a sub-empire to the bigger empire of the US,
Okay, I read on your website a quotation from John Adams. There are two ways of conquer and enslave a nation. One is by the sword, the Schwert. The other one is debt. Can you rephrase this and explain how that actually works in technical terms?
Yes. Would you like to?
No, but you have the excellent example for Argentina, like how.
Yeah. So the first president. So as soon as we became independent from Spain, most Latin American countries went right into becoming neo-colonies of England. In fact, England helped many of our countries fight the independence war, because they already had developed a much smarter game, which was the game of debt, neo-colonialism through debt. And what they did was, our first president was a puppet from England. And the first thing he did in the 1820s was to sign the biggest loan, the first loan fraud with the Baring brothers from the UK, which was not paid back until over a century later by Perón in the 40s, who canceled all the debts and said, I will cut my arm before ever signing a debt, a loan for Argentina, because he understood what this meant for any of our countries. So by the time he canceled this loan, he paid it off over a century later. It had already been paid many times over in this huge interest that I was telling you earlier. So if I give you a loan and you have to pay me 50% interest rates a month or a year, it's a great deal. I don't want you to cancel. I don't want you to pay it off, because it works perfectly for me. That's how it works. When when Perón tried to cancel this debt, they didn't want to get them back. When Kirchner paid back the debt in the early 2000s, he paid back all the debt to the IMF in like $100 million, and just to cancel it off. It was before we had this big loan now, and they don't want to get it back because the money means nothing compared to the political power that it gives these countries of the global north. Plus, imagine, most of them, they're just printing this money out of their ass. We have a friend here who wrote an article about the Federal Reserve, and maybe can explain better than me, but they're printing this money, like she said earlier, Louise was explaining about sovereign money. You know, if Japan or the US or Germany or France, they get into debt with their own currency, they can print and they can control how this currency is printed. But if Argentina or South Africa get into debt in dollars, that's completely a different game, because you have to pay we have to get dollars, and our local currency is always much lower. The inflation is huge. So, and I'm not an economist, I'm a biologist, so I cannot give you all the technical reasons, but I'm sure we have articles to send you as well. But it's a very, I don't think it's difficult to grasp how clear debt is a tool of colonialism, and you don't need an army when you can get a country into debt. Yeah.
Maybe if you asked to rephrase it, I was thinking while you were speaking, how could you rephrase it? Well, maybe another way of saying it is, tell me again the beginning of the sentence. One way of invading a country is by sword, and the other one is by death.
There are two ways to conquer and enslave a nation.
Mm-hmm. So I would say one is by blood, and the other one is by morality or by morals. Because by sword, you go in and you conquer by force, you shed a lot of blood. But if you go in by debt, you bring in morality, because debt is an extremely morally loaded concept. You hear, when you read a little bit the reactions that people give to our actions, they're like, oh, but those countries, they owe, so they should pay, this is like a moral, debt is like a moral concept, like you owe something to someone, so you have to repay this. And it's something actually that really, it veils the history of the debt. How did this actually come into place? It didn't, all of a sudden those countries were indebted and all of a sudden they owed. There's a really interesting article, if you want to read it, that explains how countries of the Global South became indebted. And for some countries it was the case that the former colonizers had to build infrastructures that they had to take on loans for, so that they could extract the resources from the colonies. But then after the formal decolonization or the formal independence of those countries, they transferred the debt that the colonizers still owed to other institutions that they had to take on to build infrastructures to the colonies. This is actually by international law, it's illegal. So they gave it to the newly independent countries, oh, well, now you have this debt. Oh, sorry, we're out. Happy Independence Day. So now you have to somehow, and you have to take on more debt to repay the debt that you now owe, plus to extract your resources that you have to, because you have to send them to the north. And then you still have this concept of the morals that those countries, somehow they owe and they have to repay, because debt is just something that you have to repay. And there are studies on it. I don't know if some of you read David Graeber, the 5,000 First Years of Debt. He explained this really well, how it's also in religions, how it's just really connected to your religious obligation to pay back your debt. But also debt cancellation is a very religious term, that in a lot of religions, debt cancellation is something that is normal, that is happening, that has happened periodically. But I think the term of the morality of that is maybe even more powerful than the sword, because also internationally you see a bloody conflict happening somewhere. It's kind of, or it feels easy to say well, okay, those who are bleeding are the ones who should be saved or protected or whatever. But if you go in with that, it doesn't work like that. Then you say, well, but those who are indebted are the ones who did some kind of economic mistake. They mismanaged their money. So it's more difficult to explain the problem of it, and the power dynamics seem apparently to be the other way around. And with the sword, it's more obvious than with that. So I think it just makes it more complicated and more veiled. That's why post-colonialism is also really a very complex and messy ground to navigate. But I think I would rephrase it in there are two ways to conquer a nation. One is in blood and one is with morality.
I find this super interesting. I didn't think about debt as a very moral thing at the first step, but actually it makes total sense when you say it like this. like somebody did a sin for being in debt somehow. And I mean, but you could also look at it the other way around. What actually is the debt on a moral and very, in fact, ground of the global north to the global south? Like, we are indebted actually. Can you elaborate that as well? Because we talk about the money that this global south owes to the global north, but what is actually the other side of the Waage?
Yeah,
do you know what of the balance?
Yeah. Of course.
Isn't that even bigger?
Yeah, it is.
Than the money debt that we
completely. If you start, I mean, if you start even 500 years ago only, then you would have the entire, not only just the climate crisis started with colonialism, so you can go back 500 years even in talking about the climate debt of the global north. It comes in with colonialism. So the amount, it's very difficult to quantify lives. It's difficult to quantify livelihoods, no? So it's very apparent that the magnitude of the climate debt, colonial debt that the global north owes to the global south is just incomparable. It's a Fliegenschiss, you would say in German, no? Like the shit of a fly compared to the debt of the global north. So it's difficult to compare because it's just it's different dimensions, and this is also why we're saying, well, the start of paying back the debt that the global north owes to the global south by just extracting all the resources and having built its power and its wealth. Thank you.
And also by contributing to or actually causing the climate crisis.
Exactly, yeah.
On historical grounds.
Yeah, so this would be just the very normal, like Esteban was saying, the low-hanging fruit and the normal first thing to do to cancel the debt of the global south for that.
And not as an act of greatness.
Yeah, exactly.
Not as an act of generosity, but as the first step toward paying their own debt, which is an order of magnitude higher. Our financial debt is in the trillions of euros. The climate debt is not quantified because it's really difficult, because you have to account emissions, which is quantifiable. But slavery, colonialism, which the IPCC in the latest report this year is finally saying that colonialism is at the root of the climate crisis. So it's in the quadrillions of euros. So the lowest hanging fruit at the first step should be cancel the debt as your own obligation and prove that you are serious for climate action. And we're seeing some positive developments, like loss and damage has become now officially negotiated, or they have created a fund. The risk is that, like they did with climate finance, they promised to pay 100 billion euros a year and so on, but they were doing that in the form of more debt and not even fulfilling, they were giving, not even living up to what they promised, and that's just 100 billion. That's nothing in the context of what is needed. I think the same may happen with the loss and damage, but it's a good development in the process of the North recognizing that they owe the South, the Global South, something. It's a recognition, and I think we need to focus in on that and build on that, because the first thing we need to get is the Global North to acknowledge they have a climate debt. That's very dangerous for them to acknowledge, because they acknowledge that, they acknowledge that they owe quadrillions of euros. Denmark did it a few months, right before COP. They paid a small amount in loss and damage before COP. So, there is some positive development. It's just really, really not enough in the context of a global crisis that we're facing, and definitely not fast enough. So we need to build the power to make it faster.
I'm just going to make a small comment for the German audience, because what you're saying is really important for the word, the choosing of the words in German, because you were saying debt cancellation is not an act of charity, right? And the only word in German that is popular about cancelling the debt is Schuldenerlass. No, and Erlass is like, oh, okay, I'm the generous part, and I will grant you this. Not cancelling. It's like I'm going to grant you the cancellation because I'm so nice, and because you deserve it. It's like, and this is why we're trying in the German-speaking part of the movement. We're really trying to place the word of the Entschuldigung and also of the Schuldenstreichung, Schuldenannullierung. Schuldenannullierung also sounds a little bit posh, but Schulden streichen is more graspable, and it's also like it's something that you just have to do. It's the right thing to do, but it's not an act of charity. It's an act of justice. So just as a side note, like we're trying to avoid the Schuldenerlass because it has this charitable character, but also it was something that was brought forward. I don't know if some of you maybe know the Jubilee movement, Jubilee 2000 movement, that was one of the most famous debt cancellation or debt relief campaigns that we know of. And there was kind of a conflict between the northern part, the Global North movements. It was a Global North-led movement that was acting in charity for the Global South. It was mostly a church movement led by churches as well. And there was a counterpart, Jubilee South, I think it was even called, that was raising this issue of like, hey, this movement is actually portraying it as an act of charity that you would have to do this. So it's also honoring a little bit of the work that others have done before us to say like, hey, we shouldn't really use those words, but really make the case for the justice effect of debt cancellation. Also saying we want to cancel the debt and we don't want to relieve it and we don't want to cut it, we want to cancel it. Not partially, but totally.
I know we talked a lot about justice and morals, but even if we, and this is super important now, but even if we ignore this, are there on top good reasons actually for cancelling the debt when aiming to fight the climate crisis?
I think you can put it very simply. The Global South has trillions of dollars of fossil fuels in the ground, many of these carbon bombs I was telling you about, like Vaca Muerta, trillions of dollars of fossil fuels and trillions of dollars in debt to the Global North. Imagine you can cancel that so that these countries can commit to using those funds that they will be free from paying back, these interest loans, to afford a just transition where they can commit to leaving these fossil fuels in the ground. So that's what Therefore Climate is calling for. But also, a little bit going back to what Louise was saying earlier, you know, one of the arguments that you will get against us is going to be like, you know, oh, they're in debt, so they did something wrong, or they have to pay their debt. Everyone has to pay their debt, right? Especially Germany doesn't really, you know, Germans are really avoidant of debt, and it has a big moral connotation. Yes. But what they fail to see is that the Global South, you know, there's a lot of corruption. Everyone knows that. But it didn't just come out of nowhere. Corruption is a legacy of colonialism. You know, when England was leaving these colonies, they made sure to divide the groups. Look what they did with India. They were behind partitioning India and Pakistan, who are now mortal enemies with nuclear weapons. They did the same in Africa. They drew arbitrary lines between ethnic groups in a way that it would lead to confrontation, in which they would have some power when they left. Same as France and so on. So, and they left the most corrupt elites in power who ensured them that they would continue to administer those countries through this corrupt class that couldn't be any less worried about their own country, and they're more worried about serving their masters in Europe. That's true across the Global South, and unless you recognize that, you will never understand why these people are signing these countries up for huge loans to the IMF and World Bank, which our people never see a penny of that. It runs back out of the country through financial mechanisms to go to tax havens and places like that, and right back to the Global North. So these are things that we need to consider, and where I'm trying to go with this is that we will not just make this happen out of our wishful thinking. We are really serious that we need to build power, and for this we need indigenous movements, we need feminist movements, but really importantly we need to connect with the working class to the organized labor unions of the world. The unions are the only actor in society that has enough power to make the changes we need fast enough. They are the champions of social struggle. They are the ones that gave us all or most of the social rights we enjoy. They come from the struggles of the workers. We need to find ways for those workers to be able to fight the climate fight now before it's too late, and not when there will be no more jobs, no more water, no more food. We know they will be fighting this fight sooner or later. We need to find ways to involve them now in a protagonical role. That's what Therefore Climate is trying to do, because it's not only here. We need the workers in the Global South to put pressure on the countries of the Global South, because our own governments are not on our side. They are just working for the colonizers. So we need the worker unions to strike the hell out of these countries, to paralyze the economies, and only then we will force our countries to the table, and then lead to a mass default on debt, to create a global front against debt like Thomas Sankara was calling for from Burkina Faso. And I close with this. Create a global front against debt where united we can stand up to the IMF and with your help in the centers of power actually force debt cancellation. That's the only way that I see that it could be possible when we build power, not just performances and good ideas, but actually blocking economies and building power internationally.
And maybe also to even cut it shorter, because you asked like what is the actual effect also for climate, against the climate crisis. When we take away this political leverage that institutions like the IMF and the World Bank have, which is debt, they no longer have the political power, the economic and political power to dictate how economies of the Global South are supposed to be structured. It's only through that right now that the IMF and the World Bank can come in and dictate through austerity programs to other countries. I mean, in Europe, you can see it in Portugal, you can see it in Greece, how those economies should be governed, be ruled. And the first thing that they are going to say is privatize and extract the resources that you have so that you can pay back the debt that you owe to us.
Any social
Spending.
spending.
Exactly. Some countries have to spend sometimes up to 5 times more on debt repayments than on the social sector, or on spending money on adapting to the climate crisis, like in Pakistan. But I think the most obvious thing is to say it's only through indebting countries that the IMF and the World Bank have the power to go into countries and tell them, like in Argentina, and these are public records that you can find. I think even The Guardian wrote an article about it, showing how the IMF and the World Bank is just publicly saying or pressuring Argentina to extract the gas resources that they have so that they can pay back the debt. So if you take away this leverage, the IMF doesn't have any leverage anymore to dictate the countries to extract the resources that are causing the emissions that are causing the climate crisis. Yeah. So by cancelling the debt, you do a direct effect for climate justice because you are cancelling something that gives them leverage as well on the environmental level as on the social level as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you so much. I think I learned a lot about just like the situation and why it would be important to cancel. Is it right? Was it right?
Yes.
Cancel the debt. Thank you. Now we're in Germany. Imagine a person in Germany, from Germany, that itself is poor, listens to us, talking about the global north, who's super wealthy, and all the you know where I want to come to. So what would you say? One, can we afford this? And second, like, what do you say to people who struggle themselves in terms of money when we always discuss this global south, global north balance topic?
Well, I think you can come back to the origins of Debt for Climate, which is connecting struggles with each other, right? And also going back to what Esteban was saying about Thomas Sankara, he was the one who was saying like the people who are exploiting Africa are the same ones that are exploiting Europe. If you look at Lindner, again, he's the perfect example for that. He's the representative, the German representative in the IMF, but he's also the one who is blocking every social progress in Germany. So you don't have to give up. It's not about giving up your local struggles. It's about combining the things that are combined in nature already, but disorganized in organization, basically. And this is also a political strategy to not make it possible to unite the struggles. But it's really about bringing the local fights that are connected to this global structure together, so that we can fight together for the local problems that are there, that working class people and other marginalized or oppressed people have, together with these global structures of oppression. Because it's only by bringing the local to the global level and the global level to the local level that we can really implement the changes that we need to improve the local situation, but also on the global scale.
And did you see the report from Oxfam from a few weeks ago that 150 billionaires have the same carbon footprint as the entire country of France? So I think the message for this person that you're asking is that the same people that are fucking us over are the same people that are fucking you over. We have the same enemies. Yeah, we have the same. It's not every average person in the global north, but the elites and the top 1% that is exploiting you here and is exploiting us down there. So as we are calling for the global south to not pay, there is also this campaign in the UK that is don't pay. So it's the same thing. It's disobedience, where this united front against debt is for us to stop paying and force the IMF and the World Bank and so on to cancel the debt. And workers here are also, in this don't pay campaign. I think we should find narratives to unite both because we have the same adversary or enemy, if you like, on the other side.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Because with this, I think it would be. I would love to come from like describing the situation and the demand that you're having, that we are having, to more strategies and how do you work and what could we do together. First, I would love to ask the audience, what about the energy in the room? And do you have any questions around what we just heard about, like, really, why canceling the debt? Why? And then we come to more strategy and what could we do? And in between, while we are hearing some questions, from Club Voltaire, wir werden einen Hut rumgehen lassen. Wer spenden möchte, spendet bitte. Wir freuen uns sehr, wenn ein bisschen was zusammenkommt. Das machen wir einfach parallel.
Hello, thank you. I'm Kerstin from Koala Collective. Thank you very much for these really interesting explanations. I really didn't know all the background about debts and about how colonialism still today has many consequences. You talked about your demand, debt cancellation. Well, you talked a lot about the problem and then about the solution, which would be debt cancellation, but this is only a short-term solution. I wonder what will happen after that. So it's a one-time cut, and debts are cancelled, but countries will need money again. Debts are, also private persons take debts for building a house. So it's in our system, it's normal that also countries get indebted for building infrastructure, for example. So what happens after this debt cancellation when countries need money again? Could you elaborate a bit more about what's your long-term solution and new system? And because also that some countries have to pay more interest than other countries. The reason behind it is that the investors think this money is, one loan is safer than another loan. So the fear would be if Argentina, for example, has to pay lower interest, nobody would give money to Argentina anymore. So that's what how the debt system works right now. So this is my question: what would the long-term solution be to that? Thank you.
Can we answer one by one? Because I will forget and lose track.
Sure.
So very, very important. And the last part of your question, that's totally true, whereas the IMF and World Bank don't function necessarily in the same logic as the financial markets, right? Because precisely countries run to the IMF when they need money for an emergency, and the IMF gives you certain loans with certain interest, but with a package of austerity and stuff. They're more interested in controlling you politically than following the market. But it's true, you have an index called Country Risk Index, and Argentina is out the roof, and that's how they determine this. But to answer the most important part of your question, and this is part of the campaign being built from the Global South, and having a Global South, do you say idiosyncrasy? Well, I don't know if you know, but way of looking at things. One thing we say in Argentina is that appetite comes as you eat. What does that mean? You're not hungry, but maybe you start eating, you start getting hungry. So there is something about this campaign that is really important for us. One thing that maybe people don't take into account, we need to simplify things. I think the most powerful thing that this campaign has done and will do is to simplify complex topics so that the larger public of the Global South and globally can join. If we cannot bring the labor unions and many other movements, but the labor unions are really important, into the campaign globally, we are not going to get far enough to what we need, because this is about power. And on the contrary, if we are able to build a global movement that is so powerful that we say, tomorrow we strike globally, and there will be no train, no supplies, no buses, nothing, no electricity, then those countries will be on their knees, the governments will be on their knees, and they will negotiate with us. So the way we look at this campaign is very strategic, that we have to start simple. We have to start with debt cancellation. And you know, when someone has the knee on your neck, like we say, debt is the knee on the neck of the Global South, you're fighting to take the next breath of air. You're not saying, oh, I need to get a loan for my house to pay in 20 years. I forgot to pick up my car from the dealership. No, so the Global South is really focused on taking the next breath of air, and canceling that debt is really important. We understand that the moment that you start building this long-term programming can also be the place where people begin to divide themselves, because it's like, oh, I don't agree with that, especially within the left. You know that we're great at dividing ourselves. Mujica, president of Uruguay, said the right unites behind interest. The left divides itself over ideologies or ideas. So we need to find a way to converge behind interest, and cancelling the debt for the global survival of humanity, to leave trillions of dollars of fossil fuels in the ground in and of itself is a great idea, and one of the most obvious things I have seen for the climate fight since it began, or the last few years with XR and so on. You know, we've been demanding tell the truth. You know, compared to tell the truth, this is more concrete, and I'm not trying to compare, you know, I work with XR and all that, but I'm just saying the slogans, especially in the Global North, have been very vague. And nobody said, okay, after telling the truth, what are you going to do, and how, you know, and I understand in Europe things are very programmatic, because, you know, it's more stable, you can plan ahead. But in this, we need to build this as appetite comes as you eat. We first need to build enough power so that we are in a position to challenge bigger systems. The debt system is the first one, but there will be no stopping us. If we can get any of this done, we will have a really powerful movement that can actually challenge a lot of the most underlying chronic conditions behind that are the foundation of capitalism, which is capitalism cannot really function as it does now if we can take away financial colonialism. Because the entire system of supply and demand, supplying the consumption in the Global North, would not be possible if you don't have this knee on the neck of the Global South. But we are looking at it from the other end. How do we build power from nothing to actually get there to challenge that? I don't know if I'm being clear enough or more confusing, but maybe you can help me.
Happy to jump in. I think you were very clear, but I think maybe can I jump in briefly here? I think it's a very important, an important question. We are also stressing in the campaign is to say this isn't the necessary first step. Because when you look at what the left or any progressive movements have been really, capable of doing is not complicating things, but like really showing the complexity of things and debating things over nights and over plenaries and plenaries and plenaries and so on. But you don't empower anyone by that. Like you can start thinking of it, and then yes, of course, it's not going to be done by just canceling the debt, which is something. If we have a global debt cancellation, that would be a first in history. So it's not a small step. We shouldn't forget about that. But then yes, you haven't solved colonialism. You haven't solved the poor economies that have been rotten by the Global North over centuries. You still have an extractivist system. How do you rebuild this? How do you democratize institutions like the IMF? How do you deconstruct them? How do you replace them? How do you... Okay, now give me an action. You know, it's really difficult, which doesn't mean that these topics are not necessary, but we also have to work in a societal situation, a political situation, where movements are completely disillusioned, there is no power on the street, There's nobody in the climate movement talking about global economic systems. The debt is something that's like, okay, what's exactly the IMF, the EWF, IMF, I don't know what that is, what does it stand for? You know, so we have a very depoliticized climate movement and a left that has completely lost connection to anything, to anybody except for itself. You know, so we really have to, we have to work with what we get, and we have to use the opportunities that we get by introducing a simple yet radical, radical I say because it goes to the root of things, not because it's radical because it blows things up. By introducing and getting this debate going again, by politicizing the movements and empowering movements again, because you can see it out there, it's just splitting and dividing, and you have to unite movements again, and we have to have a very long breath for this. System change is not something that we're going to do overnight, and we have to have these conversations, but we have to start somewhere, and that cancellation is, Esteban usually says, I'm going to say it for you tonight, that cancellation is what is creating the crack in the system, how we get in to start with system change. And as I said, that cancellation wouldn't be a small step. It would be the thing that would take away a lot of political pressure and gives a moment to restructure things, actually, to think about how can we do things differently. Without it, there's not even a chance. So this is the debt cancellation is the enabling step, the enabling possibility of system change. It's the enabling condition of system change.
Thank you. I think the question was answered. Mark, you have another one.
Thank you for being here and explaining your movement and your organization to us. It was very interesting. My question is, you talked a lot about how important it is to connect with the labor movements. And my question would be if you already spoke to Western and trade unions or labor unions from the global north, and how do they react, and what are the challenges, or are there challenges?
Yeah, I think there's barely anything but challenges. It's the million-dollar question, and obviously we're not the first to say that it's important to connect to the workers. It's a no-brainer. And I think for many years, climate activists have tried to find ways, and it's just very difficult. One reason it's difficult is that workers usually around the world are very focused on their immediate needs, you know, their job, security, the quality of life, food, and so on. And the climate crisis, especially in Europe, in the global north, seems like a faraway problem for their agenda that they have, which is full of other conflicts to fight for. And especially when you have demagogues that are actually telling them in the mainstream media that this is radicals that are fighting for the climate and, you know, blocking your roads so you cannot get to work, and they're putting them against you, putting you against them, against us. But I think the moment that we find the formula to fully connect to the labor unions in Europe and in the global north is the moment we are on to a revolution. And we started this strategically also from the global south, because when you speak to labor unions in the global south about debt, they get it. You know, you talk to them about the climate crisis, it's a similar reaction to what the labor unions here tell you. But to them about debt, they get it. So we found a key where you open a door where they come in to fight for the climate through fighting against debt. You want to get out of debt, fight to cancel the debt so we enable a just transition. Just transition is a word that it was coined by the labor unions. A just transition, so that it's a movement that is not against you. You know, they're telling them that last generation is against them, that XR is against them. They're telling them that like, all the climate. Well, here is something that is not affecting, it's not targeting you and your job, but actually targeting the same people that are fucking your life over, financial power. So I think that's the answer. We don't have all the answers to that. We had a meeting with some, of course, the first ones that will come on board will probably be the most progressive ones in Europe, if we can bring them on board. It would be probably the ones that have the least power first. But I think the moment, you know, like when Fridays for Future started, nobody saw it coming. Greta in the parliament striking, and then you have millions or hundreds of thousands of people around the world. Well, I think it's hard to imagine the future. We tend to imagine the future projecting the present in a linear form. But what I foresee that could happen if we do a good job is that we build such a massive and amazing movement where labor unions all over the global south are joining, that people here will say, oh, I don't want to be left out of this. You know, I'm a labor union here, I want to be part of this, if nothing else out of international solidarity, and out of that this movement is giving us, is empowering us to take action for the climate, which many of them want to do but they don't know how. Take action for the climate without undermining our own jobs. And for the rest, I don't have all the answers. We're supposed to go to England to meet some unions, but then I had to go through surgery, so cancel the trip. And we are meeting very few in Europe. So if you have any ideas, I think in the most indebted countries like Greece, Serbia, Portugal, maybe the unions will be more receptive to this kind of thing. Maybe some of these countries of Europe could also benefit from some debt cancellation, but would be different than the one from the Global South, but also for climate action that could benefit everyone. But these are all ideas on the table that maybe we can think together, and you being from here, maybe you guys can find ways. I know in Germany it's really difficult. I met people that have been trying to get to their labor unions for a long time, but it's not impossible. I think if we take it on and if we build that global movement that is needed, they will sooner or later find that they want to be part of it as well.
But I think there is a connection to be made as well, or to be made further even, to say, you know, who are and who will be the most affected people in the global north. It's marginalized people and it's working class people. Like nobody will, from the top, so to say, nobody will give a fuck about people who are poor, if they are affected, if they're in really polluted areas, if a flood is going to take away a poor village, like it's going to be in the media for 2 days and then it's like, they'll be fine or not, and I don't care. You know, so, and I think this is something that we will have to make really clear, to say like, you will be the first and hardest hit by the climate change that is going to come. So it is your fight, even though it's not here yet as strongly as it is in other places. And if you actually want to do something against it, stopping or changing your individual consumption behavior is an important thing, but for a lot of people, consumption is not a matter of choice, but a matter of an economic necessity, right? So if you just tell them, oh, you have to buy different stuff, or, I mean, mostly, probably all of you are on the same side of this, that is not going to bring us the change that we need. But if we actually demand that cancellation, it's not going to take away anything from anybody here who doesn't own any, or not much in the first place, but it cuts through future profit streams of the ones who profit from the things that people own here. You know, this was maybe a lot of... But this is something I think that we have to make it very clear, like the climate fight or the fight for environmental justice is something that should target workers here as well, or that is the fight of workers here as well, but in a different way that it has been instrumentalized in a way as it is like today. It's not about just not driving your car anymore. It's not about losing your job. There was one Colombian activist who was a little bit laughing about the fight over the mine in Western Germany, saying like, well, we have a mine in Colombia that's 16 or 60 times bigger than this, you know? So it's nice to shut down this coal. It's necessary and it's important to shut down this the coal extraction in Germany, but compared to mines in the global south, it's just nothing, you know, and we have to bring this comparison and this prioritization also into the fight here, so that we show this is your fight and we're bringing you a demand that is really going to change things, that is not affecting your direct life, not, at least not in the first step. Yeah.
I have a question of understanding about debt cancellation, and I don't know what the English word is, but like the difference between Schuldenschluss and Schulden cancellation.
Schuldenschnitt und Schuldenerlass?
Yes, this.
Mm-hmm. Should I?
Only you can. You better.
You wanna?
No.
So, well, there again you have the problem with the German thing, because the Erlass is not really, it doesn't really quantify anything. The Schuldenschnitt basically is saying, well, we're cutting a part of your debt, which has been done in the past and which is something that is not doing much for a country anyways. But if we say Schuldenstreichung or Schuldenstreichen, which is debt cancellation, we really put it to zero. So that's the basic demand, to put it to zero and not to maybe take off 10% or something like that. And maybe this is also a good occasion to explain a little bit the difference between debt cancellation and things that have been proposed by the IMF actually itself, which are debt for nature, debt for climate swaps, which is not the same as debt cancellation because they work in a way of that a third party buys up a very small and insignificant portion of a Global South country's debt. And in exchange for that, it gives usually NGOs, nature conservation NGOs, the power over a certain region of that area to privatize it, to put a fence around it and say, like, okay, everybody who lives here out and you're not allowed in anymore except for the people who control this area, which is going to be our employees from the north. So this is how nature or climate swaps work, which is, again, like cutting a very small portion of the debt in exchange for control by the north over the nature and the environment of the south. Debt cancellation is 0. Yeah, that was the question. You want to add anything?
While greenwashing the IMF, this debt swap, this debt for nature, debt for climate swaps of the IMF, World Bank, while all that she was saying, while greenwashing these institutions that are responsible for much of the climate crisis and the advancing of extractivism, greenwashing them as part of the solution by, swapping debt for some conservation, ornamental, decorative, that will never really hit the power, will never really threaten the multinational companies that they work for, that they are benefiting. No?
And if I get it right, we're talking about 0, bringing it down to 0, the debts, unconditional, without any, but then you have to do this, or then you have to comply to that.
Well, the thing is, and as opposite to swaps, the debt cancellation that we are demanding has to be sovereign, has to be, the just transition cannot be imposed on Argentina or Namibia or Indonesia from the World Bank or the IMF. It needs to be self-determined. And of course we have corruption. That's why we need a movement. Without, what's happening now, we have a totally imbalance of power. The people at large, billions of people, we are not united, we are not mobilized together, we don't have power together. On the other side of the scale, you have all the power concentrated in financial power, banks and fossil fuel companies. How can we balance this out? Politicians are in the middle and they only follow power. Everything else is bullshit. So they will continue to legislate and rule in favor of this side only until we can balance the equation and exceed the other side's power. Then the politicians, only then will they start to take real climate action and real actions for the benefit of humanity. We need power. So, I'm a scientist. In school, we don't learn anything about power. We don't learn anything about strategy. We are educated on our different traits and skills, but nobody taught us how do we build a movement, how do we do all these things. And this is something that I think all of us need to try to educate ourselves on, because this fight is not about the truth, it's not about science. We have the science, we know we have the truth on our side. It's not enough because we prove that we are right. Nobody cares because politicians are functioning with power, not with truth. So we need to make power follow the truth, as opposed to what is happening now, that those that know the truth are using lies to keep their power. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
I'm a poet.
Also ich glaube, man kann auch mal eine Frage auf Deutsch.
Ja, klar, gerne.
But I do have another question.
Aber tatsächlich, jeder kann sich trauen, auch auf Deutsch zu reden, dann übersetzen wir natürlich gerne.
The question I have is, I do understand that, for example, China or the IMF, the World Bank, they use debt for political leverage and for extracting resources. For example, BlackRock, what do they use debt for? Just to gain financial, or what's their issue?
Well, firstly, profit. It's just a very profitable business. The interest, it's capital, Like you invest a little bit and you get double the amount back of what you invested, so they make money for it. It's actually a question, I don't know if you have the answer to it, but actually a question that I asked myself a couple of weeks ago to someone who was just like dismissive about it, like, oh no, BlackRock doesn't have any conditions to its debt regarding fossil fuels. this is the biggest investor in fossil fuels. I would be very surprised if they wouldn't be like conditionality. That looks like, it makes them look like they are just angels who just give that because they just want to make a little bit of money. The problem is because they are private, the transparency issue comes in again. So it's very difficult to find anything about that. Also because the interest is really not on our side there. They're not interested. It would be very non-beneficial for us to know in a way. But as I said, like also there, I don't know if you know this, but like BlackRock is the advisor of the of every European banks on the issue of sustainable finance. Like the EU, they auctioned this position a couple of years ago. So the highest bidder got the position of being the counselor of all the European banks. Yes, yes. So the highest bigger. Yes. So the highest bidder got the position of advising all the European banks on issues of sustainable finance, and BlackRock surprisingly had the most money to do this and is now in that position. You know that actually the
Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's okay.
Usually the counselor doesn't pay but receives money. So it's a call usually in the EU system. If you want if you need a service, you make a call for offers, and then companies give their offers. And the cheapest wins, or the not really the cheapest, but the most economical one, which is financial. So it counts the financial offer, but also the technical offer. But it's not an auction; it's a call for offers.
If you want to call it like that, yes, it was called an auction, but it's kind of an auction, like the highest bidder, the one who would give like kind of the most benefits, the most money. Actually, I think was in the topic there as well. So you can. I'm not an expert on how it completely works.
I only know usual calls for offers. I don't know this one, but
it was called the auction for it.
Okay.
But
interesting.
Let's look it up afterwards. But at the end, they are in this position. So this is already. Empörend genug.
Can I add something that I think is going to cast light and surprise you guys? It's not directly connected to debt, but it's about BlackRock. Listen to this. Pfizer is owned by BlackRock, okay? Partially, but owned by BlackRock. Like Total is owned by BlackRock. Like they are investors in mega mining, in fracking, in a lot of companies. At the peak of the desperation for the vaccines, okay, the Global South governments were desperate for this. And how were they using their power? Pfizer, this was revealed by an advisor to the government, a guy who has the guts to do it because he used to be a guerrilla fighter. I know him, he's a doctor. He used to be a guerrilla fighter in the 60s. Most of his comrades are dead, so he has little to lose, and he's now an advisor to the government. And he revealed that Pfizer asked the government of Argentina to modify the law that protects our glaciers if they wanted to get the contract with Pfizer for the vaccines. Now you may think, how is that connected? It makes sense when you realize that that BlackRock is also the main investor in many of the mega mining companies that need the glacier law that protects the glaciers modified so that they can do mega mining in the mountains where they need to use up that water. So you understand how this network of like a spider net of power works. The same they're doing with debt. It's just not, this information is not leaked. I wish that WikiLeaks could get it all and publish it all, but until we can get that, we can learn from the few examples that do get leaked. And imagine if they were doing this to Argentina, which is a G20 country, relatively, rich. What conditions were they imposing on other countries that we never heard of to get them the vaccines?
And now the ex-chief economist of BlackRock is becoming the chief advisor of Habeck. So.
Great.
Yeah.
As we're slowly running out of time, not yet, but slowly. There is another question.
So
you're back in the game?
Yeah, I'm back in the game. We learned a lot about power and the balance, and that it's necessary to
combine the forces of the working unions around the world. But as long as this does not happen, I have a question about the politicians. You said they follow the power, but maybe I think we learned now that debts are a much smarter way to dominate countries and people than violence, and we are totally addicted to all this stuff we extract and want to have for our economy. So I think the smartest thing now was the loss and damage to switch this moral part. So what could be the next step in tackling them until we hopefully the working unions are rising?
You mean tackling them?
Tackling the politicians and putting pressure on them, like I think this loss and damage stuff is like, okay, now you are those who have a bad moral, or how you say, I don't know.
You wanna?
No, I'm still thinking about it. So
Well, I think specifically for Germany, Christian Lindner. I don't know how much you know, but in the last few actions we have done, we managed to get under his skin quite a lot. And Louise confronted him one-on-one at a public meeting. You can explain this better than me.
Of the minister.
You want to tell the story?
So yeah, so, you know, these are the beauties of an organically, like, building up campaign. Like, this was really a very spontaneous thing that someone texted, like, hey, there's the Tag der offenen Tür of the ministries in Berlin happening. Amongst others, the finance ministry, Christian Lindner. And I was like, okay, let's go. And some of us, we just went there. We tried to not look like activists. And then, we went there, and I kind of like, yeah, he made his little introduction about how great he is, and then he opened to the public about, like, okay, so if you have any question now, you can raise it, and then if you, I don't know, if you look like me, you look quite not dangerous, so I was like, I have a question. And they gave me the microphone, and then, or not they gave me the microphone. Actually, it was interesting, because Lindner, he was taking the mic away from the moderator. And he was like, no, I'm going to go around with the microphone and give the word to the people. Yeah. So he came, and he was holding it, you know, like, and I wanted to take it. So we kind of had this fight over the microphone all the time. Who won? Well, and yeah, so he just held the microphone. He was like, in the beginning, looking me in the eyes, like encouraging, you know, like a young woman trying to speak to me. And I was like, hello, I'm Louise, I'm from That from Climate. And he was like, oh. It was really nice. And I heard like people cheering in the background. I was like, oh, nice, there are more people here, great. That I didn't even know of. And then I started talking a little bit, maybe a little bit too long. And then at some point it was like, put away the microphone. And, trying to cut me short, and I was like, keep it short, and you could see how his face, you know, like people are like this, and then it was like, so I was asking him actually about, like, explaining, of course, a little bit, going towards my question, why debt is relevant and so on, and that was before the IMF and the World Bank meeting that was happening in October, and we knew that Christian Lindner would go, so I asked him, like, are you going to demand debt cancellation for the Global South at this IMF and World Bank meeting? And then he took away the microphone, and then he explained why it's so much more inclusive if you speak German, because I was speaking in English. And then he just said yes.
And we have him on video.
And then he just said yes. Then he went on explaining a little bit why it's going to be difficult because of China. But he said, like, we as democracies, we have to stand up for this and show China how it's done. And then, like, yes, I'm going to do this. And of course, this was not, he didn't do it, even though you have it on video that he said it, which is why then on the 17th of October, we went back to the finance ministry and was like, hello, you recognize me again? Here we are, because you didn't keep your promise. You didn't ask this. And then he was talking to the activists inside the ministry when we occupied it, saying, we are on the same side. This is like a Herzensangelegenheit for me as well, for the countries of the Global South. I'm on this, so I'll bring you water and coffee. And instead, the police came. Yeah, very generous. Just back from the Washington meeting. I think he was quite tired. But and then you can read up the report that they wrote about the topic of debt, sustainability, and growth in Africa. where they portray themselves as being really progressive and really being on the matter, but that cancellation is nowhere to be found. The only thing that you can find in this report is sustainable debt restructuring. That's all. And the amount of countries that were present in these discussions it's ridiculous. There were like maybe five states or something part of this discussion. So even though he's portraying himself as being on the matter and being like this progressive whatever leader, Christian Lindner, who has a heart for Africa, you know, quote unquote. He actually, you could see that he really poked him in the guts, because he retweeted, or he quoted the action, like of the account of Extinction Rebellion, saying, which of course gave the whole action a huge boost because Christian Lindner retweeted it, but saying like, oh, this action was really unnecessary, it didn't cause any disruption, and I'm doing this anyway, so this wasn't necessary. The week afterwards, all of the public, like all of the tourist visits were cancelled in the finance ministry. So yes, it did cause trouble a little bit, at least for the tourists. But yeah, you could just see that we made him retweet and react personally to it. We got him there, and I think if we continue to build up this power, we are damaging his image, and we all know that Christian Lindner is all about his image now. So, and the image that he is like portraying himself as being like very responsive and to the public, and being this progressive FPD guy, and you are always saying we're spitting his soup, you know, like, and you could feel that he was really personally touched by this. And if we keep this up, and if we keep up with the narrative as well, which is difficult, like you have to read all these technical reports, and it's really difficult to cut through all the bullshit, because of course they are going to portray themselves as the G7 who are the political leaders of the world, blah blah blah, and to read between 5 different lines is difficult, but we have to keep up the challenge, because that's the way that we can really call their bullshit and really show them, having MAPA people telling them like, this is what you're actually doing from a lived experience perspective, and this is what Debt for Climate is offering, you know? Like, if you're serious about this, talk to us, because we are the ones who have the lived experience of your policies. Yeah.
One more question, if it's possible.
Let me first of all ask one by myself, and then you can think about whether it fits to the narrative or not, and then we need to close. Because as we are talking about now about strategy and action, how to come into action. Maybe you have a few words for us. Closing words, I don't know. Not yet closing, sorry. What is your strategy? What do you think is necessary now? And how can we contribute?
Well, obviously as a global growing movement, there is global strategy, there is national strategies for Germany, but all of these will align on February 27. The strategy right now is to get the word, we need to build a global consensus that debt cancellation must be a first step toward unprecedented climate action, and that is the lowest hanging fruit of what we can do. So in that building of that global consensus, all the eyes of the movement around the world will be put in Germany on February 27. And I think out of there we can prove that it's possible, that it can lead to success. You know, we can use this opportunity to cast light on how all the arguments against us are totally wrong, you know. We need the biggest challenge we have is to change the psychology in people's minds. Where will change come from, and who will decide what the transition looks like, or what the transition is? Will it be in the hands of COP and the World Bank and the IMF and the G7, or will it come from the working class of the world and the social and climate movements? I think from the latter, we need to build that, and we need to decide how the transition will happen. So the strategy is to make as much noise as we can, be as smart as we can in our actions, so that we get into the media. So far it's been very successful. The last couple actions we did were all over the media in Europe. So I think we need to use this opportunity to hit the center of power of Germany in Europe. It's going to be extremely strategic as a target. And then in the longer run, it's just continue building power across 2023 and forward. And one of the key is to make alliances with labor unions, which is, I mean, I share this with you, is all of us can and should try to do this, because that's where the key will be to actually shifting from just activism to power. You know, just we're going to be doing a demo or a blockade to actually having power to sustain it and block things for longer and actually hurt the government until they have to come to the table. So then within all of that, there is a lot of tactics and further strategy to talk, but I think we're in a rush and already talked a lot. Maybe you can complement.
I think you were perfect. No?
Okay. Good.
Okay. So on February 27th, if we want to contribute, what do? We write you an email?
Well, you are in the center of financial power in Germany. So, you know, I don't know. We would love to come and join you here, actually. I mean, I don't know what can be done, and probably a public meeting like this is not the best place to discuss it, with phones and all that. But I think there's so much potential here. Yeah, and I'm happy to come. We're happy to come anytime to discuss it more privately or whatever. Yeah.
Sounds great. Yeah. Sounds great. Yeah, I think, okay, thank you very much for your understanding, Johannes, because this is probably the best closing words, unless there is a burning question, but I think you are still around for a few more minutes. So I think what is left to say, big thank you. Thank you so much for coming. I think this, for me, it was really insightful. I'm pretty positive that we can continue whatever we do, and yeah, yeah. For me, it was super insightful. I'm very grateful that you're here. I hope for you it was too. Thank you to you. Thank you to the Club Voltaire, as always, for hosting us here. You know, we are like sorry, now I'm switching to German again. Die KlimaKneipe findet ja monatlich statt. Also das heißt, ganz kurz der Werbeblock nochmal, was in den nächsten paar Monaten passiert. KlimaKneipe immer jeder letzte Montag im Monat. Die nächste KlimaKneipe wird als eine Ausnahme nicht live übertragen. Sorry für die Menschen in den angeschlossenen Funkhäusern. Und zwar aus Gründen, denn wir sprechen über Adbusting. Und ich verrate nicht mehr, aber es ist auf jeden Fall sicherlich super spannend, hier in diesem Raum zu sein und ganz vertraulich zu sprechen. Am 19.12. Ja. Super, vielen Dank. Und dann weißt du bestimmt auch das genaue Datum der übernächsten, denn am 30.01. kommt Professor Dr. Lessenich und spricht über
Externalisierungsgesellschaft.
Der Wahnsinn, der Normalitätswahn. Okay, sehr gut. Wir freuen uns, wenn Menschen kommen. Wir freuen uns, wenn ihr uns supportet, und wir bedanken uns bei euch, dass ihr da wart. Danke. Vielen Dank.